So, as you know, Boris Johnson basically gave a speech. Well, as you know, I've already done a video on my thoughts on it, but what did Boris Johnson actually say? Now, it was a lot of piffle, but the problem is, just like all these ridiculous Brexit speeches we've been getting, it's been doublespeak, having to read between the lines and having to try and interpret what Boris says. So here we go. So this is what he said today regarding deregulation. So to understand why EU regulation is not always suited to the economic needs of the UK, it is vital to understand that EU law is a special type of law, unlike anything else on earth, and it is not just about businesses convenience. Not about business convenience. It is about expressly teleological. It is expressly teleological. Sorry, and it is there to achieve a political goal. So now to try and decode what this actually means. So we know from what he said previously that this is a code for deregulating the economy and lowering employment and environmental protections. He has a long campaign to scrap the social chapter. To boil it down to the single market, scrap the social chapter of what he said on December 4th back in 2012. There is little doubt that this is the extra stuff that the extra stuff from Brussels that is helping to further the arteries to the point of sclerosis. The weight of employment regulation is now backbreaking. The collective redundancies derive the Atypical Workers Directive, the Working Time Directive, and 1,000 more. Boris Johnson, June 6th, 2014. And he is now, and he has talked about how Brexit is an opportunity to deregulate. This will be an opportunity for the country to get rid of some of the burdensome regulation that it has accredited over the last 44 years. He said on this on March 28th, 2017. So basically he said, let's go forward and just deregulate because, you know, there's no reason to have regulation, right? So let's move on to the NHS. So what did he say in his speech? So, freed from EU regimes, we will not only be able to spend some of our Brexit bonus on the NHS, but as we develop a new stem cell technology, in which this country has long been in the lead, it may be that we will need a regulatory framework, scrupulous and moral, but not afraid of the new. So, what does this actually mean? Well, there was no mention of all the 350 million a week that Boris had constantly promised during his campaign. He has already betrayed millions of people by going back on this pledge, so let's not underestimate this. He voted against giving the NHS 350 million a week in the House of Commons as well. So in the reality, Boris Johnson doesn't care about the NHS. He's just using it as a political point-scoring device in this speech. In fact, to quote this is a comment on Boris on the NHS and privatisation of it. So, if the NHS services continue to be free in this way, they will continue to be abused like any free service. If people have to pay for them, they will value them more. Boris Johnson, 2003. So yeah, of course Boris Johnson and his cronies want to do this. Northern Ireland. This is incredibly worrying. Boris Johnson, in his speech, mentioned nothing. Nothing. But what does this actually mean? So to say nothing about it, is to, you know, when we're continuing what they've recently said, that the Cabinet intends to take the UK out of the customs union. This will jeopardise the Good Friday Agreement. He promised during the referendum there would be no change in Northern Ireland, but now has nothing to say about how it can be achieved while leaving the customs union. To quote Johnson himself, "I think the situation would be absolutely unchanged." He said this on the 29th of February 2016. The whole thing about the customs union and the technical difficulties is all being turned into great superstition, into the equivalent of the millennium bug, he said on the 28th of July 2017. This is to say that he did this speech and said nothing about this, because even the Northern Irish government have literally said, look, we don't know what the British government wants, but anything that will change the status quo and break the Good Friday Agreement, we will veto. So, trade deals. What did he have to say about it in his speech? It is only by taking back controls of our laws that UK firms and entrepreneurs will have the freedom to innovate without the risk of having to comply with some directive devised by Brussels at the urgings of some lobby group, with the aim of holding back a UK competitor. That would be intolerable, undemocratic, and would make it all but impossible for us to do serious free trade deals. So what does he mean again? When Boris Johnson talks about the freedom to innovate, he means deregulation and scrapping vital protection for workers and the environment. Boris Johnson has said he sees all kinds of opportunities in a post-Brexit UK-US trade deal, despite concerns that such a deal would mean that the UK accepting imports of chlorine-washed chickens and hormone-fed beef, as well as concerns about opening up the NHS to privatisation by US healthcare companies. So, you know, again, more reasons not to do Brexit. Environmental protections. So what did he say? We can simplify planning and speed up public procurement, and perhaps we would then be faster in building the homes young people need. And what might decide that it was indeed absolutely necessary for every environmental impact assessment to monitor 2 life cycles of the snail and build special swimming pools for newts. So Boris Johnson's mockery of the environmental impact assessment shows a clearly real agenda of Brexit, despite all the crowing and supposed green Brexit talked about from the people like the Environmental Secretary, Michael Gove. They want to scrap environmental protections on wholesale. That would be insane to do. Absolutely insane to do. It is ludicrous to blame the EU for its own government's failure to build enough houses. Domestic housing policy is not something over which the EU has any influence. And this is what I've been talking about before. The UK government has done this for years. It has taken every opportunity to shift the blame. Oh, it's not our fault, it's some EU directive, or it's something to do with the EU, it's not our fault. They have Europeanised failure and nationalised success, when in many cases it has been the nationalised failure and a European success. So that is the key point to take away from Boris Johnson's speech. It was all about deregulation of not only just the environment, but, you know, doing trade deals which would not have any beneficial effect, to say nothing about Northern Ireland, and to basically use the NHS as nothing more than a tipping point. And as said, any UK-US trade deal would open up the NHS to be privatised by US private healthcare companies. And you've seen the state of the US healthcare system? Are you honestly saying you want that in the UK? Because I'll tell you now, the US per head, well, in the UK currently per head, it costs us about £2,000 per person per head in this country. You go over to the US for their healthcare system, which is privatised, it costs them £5,000 per head, roughly. Well, which one's cheaper? The universal healthcare system and NHS we have here, or that private healthcare system which Boris and his chums are so eager to bring into the UK? You tell me which one you genuinely, honestly want. Because I know which one I want. I want the NHS.